Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Institute for Government. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Tim Durrant. I am a Programme Director here at the IFG, and I'm delighted to be hosting this discussion about how we support new ministers in their roles. It is 1 week since the general election, 6 days since Keir Starmer became Prime Minister and started forming his government, and we think we now have a nearly full ministerial team. There are 26 people attending Cabinet at our last count, and 39 parliamentary Under-Secretaries of State, although they keep adding a few more, so there might be more by the time we leave in an hour. Here at the IFG, we've always been interested in how ministers can achieve what they want to achieve in the goal. They're the top of each government department. We think it's a really important job. And since we were set up, we have worked with government ministers and opposition parties to help them think about how they can hit the ground running and make the most of their time in office, because we know that their time is pretty short. It's a whirlwind process. A week ago, these people were campaigning to win their seats, and they are now making decisions on behalf of the country. So how can they be supported to succeed? What are the skills and behaviours that make a good minister, and how can they build those? How can they make the most of their previous experience? And does the presence of several experienced ministers in this government mean that they can help their new colleagues, or will that be a source of tension? To discuss all this and more, we have a fantastic panel. We will be joined by Chloe shortly. But if I work down this way, Dr. Paul Chapman, who is a Senior Fellow at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford, the Right Honourable Baroness Armstrong of Hilltop, who was Chief Whip and Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in the last Labour government, and Ruth Turner, who is a Senior Director at the Forward Institute, which does professional development for lots of different organisations, and was Director of Government Relations in Tony Blair's number 10. We will be kicking off with some discussion and then open the floor to questions from the room and from those online. If you're online, you can add your questions to the Slido. I've got an iPad here, so we'll try and bring in as many of those as possible. One of my colleagues is also tweeting some of the key points from the discussion. We are using hashtag new ministers, so if you would like to do that, please join in. My first question was going to be for Chloe, so I'll wait until she gets here. But Ruth, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you've worked in government, you've worked with people in the private sector, the public sector. How do you think senior leaders can best be supported to achieve their goals, and how different are the different sectors you've worked with?
Okay. I remember a number of years ago being given some really good advice by David Putnam, who was a kind of mentor to me in many ways. And I was involved in setting up some leadership development around responsible leadership for people across a lot of different sectors, and trying to get my head around how we could do something that was as relevant to the Army or the Bank of England as it was to Tesco or EasyJet. And David said that, he started his career in advertising, where he discovered all of the really specific, unique things about advertising. And then he moved into filmmaking and discovered also that was a unique, very special world. And, he then went into politics and education. And in each of these places, he got the story that there is nowhere like this. Right? And of course, the point is everybody was right about that. So there are some really distinct differences that I think are quite important. And there are also some things which are common to all leaders, all leadership roles, because they're common to human nature and how humans respond to pressure, how humans respond to opportunity, to what the impact that power has upon us, no matter how virtuous and strong we think we are, etc., etc. So I remember a long time ago when I was at number 10 and had some involvement in some of the reshuffles, getting phone calls from business leaders who would say, well, that was a right mess, wasn't it? Let me tell you, let me give you some advice as to how you can do it properly. Some of it was very useful, but of course the issue is if you sack somebody from your company, they tend to go away, which isn't the case if you get rid of somebody from Cabinet. So what I would say is maybe two things to think about. The first thing is that when you see yourself as being in an exceptionally difficult position, that's a sort of mindset where you also, unless you're very careful, start to give yourself exceptional excuses, where there's compensatory behaviour because things are so incredibly hard and nobody understands you. So it's a dangerous path to go down, I think, to think of yourself as completely unique. Secondly, that particularly in the early days, I suspect it's probably important to double down on the stuff that's always true about leadership, and the kind of things about human nature and teams, and not to step over the obvious stuff about building trust and building relationships with people, because and the kind of standards, setting the standards and putting in place some of the practices that will keep you steady when things go wrong, because a lot of things will go wrong.
And on that, do you think, how do you, putting your mind in the shoes of putting yourself in the shoes of new Labour ministers, how do you think they'll be finding that? Because politics can be quite a sort of solitary profession.
Yeah.
They've now got teams of hundreds or thousands of civil servants looking to them, asking for decisions. What do you think they're going to be feeling and thinking about that?
I don't know. I mean, I guess they'll probably be feeling pretty excited and daunted, I would have thought. Probably also reassured by the machine. You know, because one of the things that they are brand new, but they will be going in and they will be well supported by private offices and civil servants who've got an immense amount of wisdom to offer. And so I think that they'll probably just have to chart their own course between knowing when to rely on the machine and the way that things are just done, and when to try to disrupt that. And that takes a fair bit of wisdom. So they're going to have to try to balance, if you like, the desire for early momentum with the necessity of any leader coming into any position, which is to listen probably about 10 times more than you talk.
Brilliant, thank you. Baroness Armstrong, so you were Chief Whip in the last Labour government. How and Ruth has mentioned reshuffles, how much do you think ministers' kind of performance is taken into account when they are assigned to jobs, and how do they get feedback, if at all?
Well, I hope it is taken into account. I started in government, and there's somebody there who was there on day one for me. Moira was appointed to run the social exclusion unit, and I became a minister in what was then the Deputy Prime Minister's Department, Environment, Transport and the Regions, with John. But I and the Prime Minister knew I was interested in matters of social exclusion because of my training as a social worker and so on. And so I was very much involved in one of what was almost seen as a side issue of some people, but was actually fundamental. And that was, how did we reach those people who really had, now we would say, left behind, whatever. And that was a theme for me throughout my time in government, even when I was Chief Whip. But I start with my experience in John Prescott's office team, because John and I weren't close politically. But I was on the NEC and of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, and was involved in the political end and not just in the policy end, as it were. And after a while, John said to me, "I thought you were a plant from Tony." But actually, I know that you have got the political interests of the government at your heart, and I really trust what you're doing. And the real reason for that was I never left him blindsided. But that is about what Ruth is talking about, and that is, you have to understand that you're a member of a team and you will be taking decisions that will be difficult for everybody, but you've actually got to do that in a way that they don't feel, crikey, we weren't expecting that. And so those ministers who actually got that was recognised, and that was taken into account in reshuffles. And when I became Chief Whip, Tony was my neighbour in County Durham, so he knew me very well from before we got into Parliament. And of course, I'd gone for the seat that he got, and didn't get it. But my people had supported him at the end of the day, so part of the reason he'd won it in the last ballot was because my people had moved to him by then. But you needed to know what the Prime Minister was thinking. The time I was at DUTR, I never had to go and ask, because you knew, it was very clear what direction of travel the Prime Minister expected, and that meant those of us in departments could get on with it. And so, even though John was a bit sceptical, to put it mildly, about mayors, I got that. I got him to accept that, because he could see politically what I was trying to do, and he was okay with that. And on a whole range of things, you have to understand the team you're working in, and you have to know that you can get on and take decisions without getting a phone call from whoever saying, why the hell did you say that on the Today programme, or whatever. And for me, as Chief Whip, I had to have my ears open and hear what other members of ministerial teams were saying about their colleagues, know what they were like in the chamber, know what they were like on committee in terms of how they dealt with the legislation. That also then meant that they had to work effectively with the whip that was attached to their ministerial team, because if they didn't do that, the whip wouldn't be working out what extra support they needed in front of a committee or whatever. That is always very important because the ministerial team, the ministerial job can come unstuck. You may be brilliant at the policy, but if you don't know how to deal with the chamber, if you don't know how to deal with your colleagues in the ministerial team and in the whip's office, and if you get the relationship with civil servants wrong, you can end up in trouble.
And how can people develop those areas of knowledge and skills? Like, can you prep for that beforehand?
I think you can, but on the other hand, it is also, I hear what, what Ruth was saying about everybody sees their job as very special. The problem for a minister is that they normally have a constituency too. In my case, it was 250 miles away. And all my staff, the staff I hired, all of them were in the constituency. I didn't employ anybody at Westminster. But that meant I needed to be able to be given the space and the support from the private office to enable me to manage the relationships with the constituency office and to spend some time there.
Yeah.
You can't not spend time in your constituency when we have a first past the post system. So it's the balance of those things which is very different, because as well as being in a ministerial department taking all these decisions about that, you're an employer of people who are working for you in the constituency.
Yeah.
And if you don't make sure they get what they need, you'll never get re-elected.
Yeah.
But also you'll get a reputation of not being a good employer.
Yeah.
And so, all of these things are things that have to be taken into account, which is quite honestly why I also feel one of the strengths is people who have run things before or have had jobs where they've had some responsibility. But you can't guarantee that that's going to happen.
No.
Somebody might be brilliant on policy, but not actually. So I used to make sure, when I then went to the Cabinet Office, I actually spent time training my 2 new young ministers. It was their first job in government. And I made them go into the chamber when there's nobody there to practice. I went through very carefully with them, again and again and again, what they were expected to do. and how much time they spent on ministerial stuff, when they made sure their box was finished so that and that they didn't keep their staff there or their private office there late, because they had the right to get home and see their families too. All of these things, I saw that as my responsibility. And actually, I'd done the same when I was in DTR, because the young minister or the other ministers, they needed to know. The Deputy Prime Minister had other roles he had to get on with. And I used to just go walk around to all the ministerial offices to make sure they're okay and there were no complaints, so that he knew they were actually working well and so on. But yes, somebody knows and somebody watches. And I might say as well, in reshuffles, the Cabinet Secretary will be there, and they will be giving the civil services view of how the ministers are doing.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Most ministers don't realise that.
And we can maybe come to the civil service views of ministers in a little bit. But I want to say welcome to Chloe Smith.
Hello.
Thank you very much, former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and Science, Technology and Innovation, I believe, and as of last week, no longer an MP.
Indeed, yes. And apologies for being late.
No, not at all.
Very sorry.
Paul, I was wondering, picking up on some of what Hilary was just saying about people who know how to run things and more formal training. You run the Major Projects Leadership Academy at the Saïd Business School, which has a course for new ministers. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what happens there, what the kind of things you cover with ministers and how they find it benefits them in their kind of day-to-day.
No, happy to. So I wouldn't presume to understand the mind of the new Prime Minister, but I've got a sneaky suspicion that if he did come across a magic lantern, I think he's already done one wish for what's going to happen on Sunday night in the Euros. He's already got one of the wishes, which presumably was to be elected. But if there was a third one left, I suspect it would be to get stuff done. I'm going out on a limb here. It did seem to be something of a criticism of other administrations that, where did they fall down most? It was not getting stuff done. So that's the thing that I'm really interested in. So I've just stood down as the Vice President of the Association for Project Management. So lots of private sector, lots of public sector, a community that comes together to professionalise getting stuff done. So that's it. At the Saïd Business School, we run effectively a commercial operation. We do training programs for sort of senior leaders, executives all around the world, mostly in the private sector. But for the last 12 years, we've run a program for senior civil servants, which is the Major Project Leadership Academy. And one of the offshoots of that is a program for ministers. And partly it comes out from working with senior civil servants who are accountable for getting stuff done in government. You will hear comments like, if only the operating environment was better set up, which is kind of code for directors general, permanent secretaries, the parliamentary side of things, and ministers. So there just seemed an opportunity, an invitation. And I got the sense that it was the first time that a structured programme for ministers had been set up.
Let's come back to that.
I may be corrected. I don't know how far we're reaching back. But we delivered 6 cohorts for junior ministers, to which quite a few cabinet ministers also joined in. And the basic curriculum was not project management, because that's not what they need to do. It's how do you lead a scale enterprise system? And I think that's the hardest challenge. So when I engage with an organisation, it's like we'd like to do some training. It's like, let's understand who goes on the programme. So, it's slightly technocratic. What's their capabilities now? What is it they need to do well? And the intervention is the bit that gets you from A to B. And my casual observation of ministers is it's the most diverse group of people. So if we were doing a programme for someone like BMW in Germany, if you were at management grade this, you've had 10 years of professional experience, learning and development, and pretty much everybody does this, and they need to get to there. It's a really straightforward ask. But what you've got is a real breadth of capability in the political system, and I think that will be particularly acute at the moment with such a new cohort. So you get people from all manner of backgrounds, experiences, ambitions, other interests, and coming together. And then that has to meld with exactly as you've described, their kind of personal circumstances and their other commitments. They're all still constituency MPs. Some are based locally, some are based elsewhere. Their domestic circumstances. So the what of the programme is kind of quite focused, but the how needs to be able to accommodate all of those other needs.
Range. Brilliant. That's really interesting, thank you. And I should say, so we've got this brochure which you can see outside, it's on our website, and from our interviews with various former ministers, there is a lot of positive praise for Paul's programme. So
kind of Robert Buckland to say
absolutely.
those words.
Clearly found it very helpful. Hilary, I want to come back to you in a second to hear more about why Paul is wrong. But Chloe, I thought it'd be good to hear your views on anything that you've heard, but also, you've just left government. What do you think are the key skills that ministers need, and how can they develop those?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's really good to be with you today, and I'm glad that the IFG is putting this on. I think it's really important, and alongside, the likes of what we've just heard there from the MPA, there is also a programme that the IFG does, and that's really good and important and necessary. Because I think when you go in as a minister, one of the sort of emotional reactions can almost be, oh my goodness, I feel quite alone. Mm-hmm. And actually, to get through that, you need to know where the sources of support are. So it's good that we're doing this today. Now, why would you feel alone in what is a very busy environment? You might feel that way because you are suddenly spinning with new things. And I think that's probably going to be particularly the case at the moment for obvious reasons. A lot of new faces, large numbers of new faces. And indeed some very new MPs who've just gone into ministerial posts, actually, although for interesting good reasons. I'm thinking of Georgia Gould, clearly good executive experience from elsewhere, but nonetheless straight in as a minister, and a few others as well in that position. But you're also spinning because you've got a brand new mission and a brand new environment, as you perceive it. So the key success factor that I think they'll need to be thinking about is how to maintain your clarity of thought, of purpose, and of action. And you need to have an amount of that set from the outset. 80-90% of that you probably want to have fixed in your mind as you go in. Of course, you need to retain the ability to react and respond naturally, and we'll probably come on to the nature of doing that, as we draw the discussion out today. But you've got to keep that clarity because actually everything else is moving very, very fast around you. You may have the benefit of being in a good team, and I'm delighted to hear Hilary's reflections of how to lead a team of junior ministers well. That isn't always the case. There's some shockers around. I'm sure we've all seen that. And the experience actually of a permanent Undersecretary of State versus a Minister of State versus a Secretary of State is quite different. They're different role descriptions, actually, for good reason. Nonetheless, a lot of spin going on, so you've got to keep your clarity. I think you do well if you're able to enter in with a clear plan of what you wish to do. I've had, in some of my roles, the opportunity to do that. Notably, actually, when I was serving at the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, specifically because it was a maternity cover role. Unusual. Again, we can come on to the whys and wherefores of that. But in that instance, I was able to have a very well-formed plan, a 10-week plan. Here's what I wanted to see every week. Please deliver alongside me. And we did so. You're not going to have usually quite such a clear-cut environment as that, but if you're standing there right now in the new government as it stands today, you potentially have 5 years' worth of thinking and acting ahead of you. You can make a good and wise attempt at what that plan needs to look like. You should have the self-discipline to try to keep to it. You need to be able to respond to events, and you need to have a clear sense of what your particular, effectively, job description is. Amongst that amount of spinning of things around you. And I think if you can do those things and do them well, to start to paraphrase Rudyard Kipling, you will stand a chance of being a good minister.
Brilliant, thank you. There's so much in there. I mean, to your point about people's heads are spinning, at what point do you think is useful for them to think about how they are doing the job? Because the first few days are just meetings and briefings and reading and all the rest of it. So is it week one? Is it month one? I mean, I'm sure it's different for everyone, but how did you find that? When did you work out how you were going to actually do the job?
My strong advice would be to keep a part of your brain on that from the very outset, because actually the level of intensity of the environment will overwhelm you otherwise quite easily. And that consists of the media, it consists of Parliament, it consists of your constituency, as Hillary's rightly just pointed out. All these things absolutely are in kind of overwhelm mode, frankly. So you don't want to, return 4 weeks later to thinking, oh my goodness, did I get it right? You want to be thinking from the outset, proactively, how am I going to keep a bit of headspace in order to be able to ensure that I'm delivering what I want to be delivering? Now, some of that you would funnel into good governance at the outset. And this is partly a bit of project management, it's partly a bit of team management, team leadership. There are techniques for this. You simply adopt the techniques and apply them. Fundamentally, it's a job like any other. Do your governance well and lead people well. Have weekly catch-ups, have fortnightly reviews of what you're intending to have got done. Don't be sort of precious about the fact that this is a slightly different environment. The other thing I think you want to keep in the back of your mind from the very outset is something to do with subject matter. And this is because not only are you a leader and not only are you a part of an apparatus that is trying to do a certain mission, you are also actually called upon to be a subject matter expert. And if you don't, or if you fail at that, you'll get found out pretty rapidly. So how, from the very outset, actually, are you going to be able to keep on top of that, again, absorb change, but also know what the truth is? And I sort of say this with a smile in my voice, because in the 21st century, this is becoming a slightly vexed question, isn't it? But seriously, how are you going to be able to stay in good touch with subject matter and give time for that in order that you can continue to be the leader and the appropriate expert? And you have to do that kind of planning from the outset rather than forget about it and then come back to it in a month or 2 months.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. I want to come to questions from the audience in a little bit, but I just want to go back to what you were saying, Hilary, about what had happened in the last Labour government in terms of more sort of organised support for ministers and how they could develop, and anything you want to add, Ruth?
Well, I mean, Ruth will probably remember Val Amos and I worked together when we were both in Cabinet to provide a training opportunity for new junior ministers, but we also used then, I think it was, wasn't it the Civil Service College that was then abolished in the coalition government. I always thought that was a mistake. But they ran programmes for all ministers, and every minister was expected to go. Before we got into government, there was a programme a bit like the one that you've been running to here, and I suspect I don't know whether you've been doing anything, but other people have been doing programmes for shadow ministers, but we had programmes at some college or other, I've now forgotten the name of it, that we had a couple of weekends there. At one stage, everybody from the shadow teams were there for training about transition and so on. But there were, very importantly, programmes that people were expected to turn up to, some of which we ran internally, but some of which we ran with the Civil Service College.
Do you want to add anything on how that worked, or what was the reaction of ministers? How did they find it?
Well,
did they find it helpful?
I remember bringing the paper and backing up Valerie and Hilary. And interestingly, and this I think is a reflection of how much times have changed in a really good way, was that initially we faced some resistance and were told that this could only be done with junior ministers because it would be an admission of failure and highly embarrassing for senior leaders to do it. And I'd come in to number 10 without any experience of government and was just astonished because every senior leader I knew in every other field, well, any good one anyway, felt that it was actually part of their responsibility to keep learning. Not that they all do it brilliantly, but I was really interested in your point, Chloe, about subject matter expertise, because I can completely see what you're saying, that you have to know enough to be able to take a judgment. But one of the things that we found outside of politics, actually, with others, is that subject matter expertise is so deep and things change so quickly that actually there's a temptation to try to sort of get some safety, I guess, in the subject matter expertise. But the really important leadership thing actually is to only know enough to be able to commission and discern and decide rather than trying to kind of master it. Because I think that this is one of the big sort of leadership shifts that when you get to the really top jobs in any sector you have to shift, which is that it's only partly a technical job. And actually it's a strategic, the human and the political.
Absolutely.
So I really love the fact that, you know, in the last week or so, there seems to be a determination to say, well, look, what's the right thing to do? You know, what are the experts saying is the right thing to do, and let's do it. And, you know, in many ways, long may that last. There is, however, something about what does it all add up to? Because if, you know, the right thing to do in planning is X and the right thing to do in another area is Y, etc., but cumulatively it looks like it's an attack on a particular sector or demographic, etc. Very soon there's a political tipping point where it goes from policy into politics. And politics isn't a dirty word in this concept, it's about legitimacy and credibility and consent. And employers in the private sector find this too, actually, that, you know, it is that balance all of the time of trying to kind of triangulate, I guess.
And if I can just come back very quickly, my experience was that those ministers who thought they knew the policy better than anybody else were a nightmare. Partly because they didn't then work effectively with the civil service. The civil service has the responsibility to offer you different ways forward. And if you think you know it all, they stop doing that. Because they're intimidated and they're they feel, God, this minister's really not going to take me suggesting this because it's not all fully worked out. Whereas my experience was that the more you were able to actually, yes, have hold of what it was you wanted to do, but that you actually expected the civil service to give you really thoughtful and push you, thoughtful stuff, and push you to think about what the effect of this would be and how are we going to, you know, you really had the relationship then between the civil service and the ministers working well. And therefore, you know, I always believe in education, the more ideas are flowing around, you know you've got to take a decision. The other ministers that are a nightmare are ones that can't take a decision. But, you know, you need to know what the alternatives are and what the pitfalls are.
May I add more? This is really good that we've drawn out reactions on this point, and I think that the 2 points made there are absolutely right. The one thing that disappears from civilian life to being a minister is thinking time. It doesn't exist. There is none of it. You are rattling at high speed from one thing to another. And partly that's a function of how diaries are constructed, some of which you can get control over, but fundamentally, you are fighting a sort of uphill war about time, really. So therefore, you do want the things that Ruth and Hilary have just articulated, but you're short on the time that allows you to think that through and be sure that it's correct, that what's being presented to you is correct. And the result of that, if it goes badly wrong, is that it's all just a conveyor belt. The minister basically becomes just a mouthpiece for the next parliamentary question or the next thing in a speech or the next slightly duff line to take. And that isn't doing it properly. You know, I mean, you'll be aware of the joke of the minister that gets to the end of the folder of the speech and the last page is blank and somebody's written on it, you're on your own now, chum. I mean, that never actually happened to me, I'm delighted to say, but it's a serious point underlying the joke. You need to know enough so that you're not in that last position, but crucially, you need to know enough so that you've got the tools of the democratic accountability, as Ruth says, over what can otherwise feel very strongly like a bit of a sausage machine, a bit of a conveyor belt.
I want to come to questions in the room, but please feel free to jump in the panel. So we have a microphone, gentleman at the back there.
Hi, 3 quick questions. Some ministers who I think are great.
Tell us who you are.
I'm Craig. I'm an academic. The Attorney General and the Prisons Minister are not MPs. They are going into the Lords. That's a very different way of doing things, and I suppose they're not doing politics in the usual way. The other one is that we don't have a transition period. So you're Prime Minister, you're not Prime Minister, and then you're Prime Minister. So how do other countries do that? I know America have 3 months, I think. So should we change that? Should we look at changing that period? And Chloe, I remember going to Norwich to Gay Pride and you on the panel. I think, is it 2010 you were elected?
Yeah,
Can't remember. 9, so it was around the period. And you seem a completely transformed person. So politics, as in you're so physically, mentally, more confident, etc. So obviously politics changes how you behave, how you interact with others. I mean, that's just an observation. It may not be true at all. So how does politics do that?
A lot in there. Thank you very much. There's a lady here in the middle.
15 years of personal growth.
Absolutely.
I'll think about my answer.
I'm Hattie. I'm an A-level student. In terms of considering the role of SPADs, what is the panel's views on whether or not SPADs can actually provide a useful function in new ministers taking on their roles and making the roles their own, or whether actually it can potentially have a more damaging influence at times, particularly if the SPAD maybe takes over the role of the minister?
Great. Thank you very much. And do you want to pass it to the gentleman next to you?
I'm Mark Corbett from London Higher. I just note the title of the event is around new ministers. In recent years, it seems that's all we've had is new ministers. So I was just wondering, what is the ideal time for a new minister? And to really succeed, do they need to be an experienced minister? And where there is a lot of sort of chopping and changing, how to ensure policy continuity in that environment?
Brilliant. Some really good questions here, and they're all very IFG issues, so thank you very much. We'll come back for another round of questions shortly. So who would like to pick up any of those? I mean, Lords ministers. I don't know if that's anything, Baroness Armstrong. I mean, you haven't been a minister from the Lords, I don't think. But
No, they very sensibly, very rarely ask. I've never known them ask an ex-cabinet minister to be a minister in the Lords.
Apart from David Cameron.
Apart from David Cameron, but he wasn't really a minister from the Lords.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
very different. Sometimes you need people who are bringing a level of expertise or notoriety in order to get credibility with the sector. And I see Patrick Vallance in that way. And I think the other thing, I have some very interesting stories that I can never tell you about what happened to Ken Clarke when he was trying to reform justice. Reforming prisons, reforming the way we work in the criminal justice system, any government finds that problematic. And therefore having someone who has a reputation from a Tory family of doing it differently in a way which me as an ex-social worker would approve, gives you a bit of space as a government to actually do things in a different way, hopefully. And you've got to think of that when you're Prime Minister. And then about the whole stuff about churn, don't know who that was, but the churn, a Prime Minister has to manage his party as well as his country. And it might be country first, party second, but the party ends up, as the last Prime Minister found, killing you off if you don't actually know how you're going to manage it. And enabling people who are really talented to shine or not shine as a minister is part of that, and to bring them in. And so, you know, I used to say the most difficult thing for the PM at reshuffles was that he needed space to put new people in. And the only way you get space to put new people in is to kick other people out. And that's never popular. But, you know, that's the biggest challenge in a reshuffle.
And I think it'll be interesting, won't it, to see how this Prime Minister approaches that.
Yeah.
Because as you said, Mark, there was a lot of churn over the last few years, but partly that was because of changes of PM and people resigning. If Starmer can keep people in post for a while keeping his party happy, that will be the big challenge. Paul, I wondered about that same question. I mean, do you have a sense from the ministers you've worked with of people who've been in post for longer or shorter times, how they feel? Do they feel more confident? Do they feel more sort of, to Chloe's point, sort of subject matter experts on what they're dealing with?
Well, I started working with government in 2012, but with senior civil servants, and I'd only ever worked with the private sector before that, and hadn't appreciated until now that most of the ministers were in post for most of that administration, partly as a result of it being a coalition and the agreement around it. Yeah. And it was only subsequently that we got into kind of more recent times and the chopping and changing, where you go, do you know, that was a really weird, stable 4 or 5 years, which did seem to have knock-on effects into the civil service. Most of government, certainly in terms of getting stuff done, is done by the private sector. That stability is, it's often said, but it's true, that stability is viewed very warmly. Not so much at the time, but you certainly see it elsewhere. We've got a contract for umpteen £billion to get this thing done. It's an obsoleting bargain until the next minister comes in, is not anything that a PLC board wants to be here or look at. Yeah. Because at that point, are they going to forward commit resources into that relationship? Nope. Too big a risk. We'll point it elsewhere. So there's I think, knock-on benefits of stability that aren't fully appreciated. But I think that also runs counter to another bit that I think is coming out slightly in this conversation is, do you trust the minister? Do you have confidence in them?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, very interesting. Ruth, go on.
Do you want me to talk about SPADs?
Yes, that was what I was going to suggest. Yeah, go for it. Hattie's question.
Well, I mean, of course they can be a total nightmare, and they can be a nightmare for one of two reasons. One is if it really goes to their heads and they decide to abuse the position, and there's all sorts of stories which will not be told about how that's happened under every government. Or it can be a real nightmare because they're asked by the minister to carry all of the messages that the minister doesn't want to have anywhere near them. So, the enthusiastic yes from the minister, or if a SPAD running along beside saying he actually meant no, it happens, right? But it can be incredibly helpful for a minister and the department, actually, to have a really good SPAD who can actually look at some of those really tangled issues where there's no obvious answer, but judgment has to be made. A really good SPAD can also look at who's not in the minister's diary. So who is not being heard? I did a really interesting exercise with actually private sector, private offices, but talking to the people who schedule for them and saying, let's just have a little look at who you are putting in front of the key decision maker and who hasn't got a look in, and does the key decision maker know that those people exist and yet haven't been heard? So there are things like that, and I also think that there is something, Chloe talked about the loneliness, and I find this also talking with people who are chief execs or excos. It's really genuinely very, very tough, very lonely. Nobody performs at their best when they're insecure and paranoid, which is what most of the political system is designed to engender in individuals, and that's not good for any of us. And actually having somebody who's got a strong enough personal relationship with you that they can say, look, if you do that, you are just going to come across like an absolute total, is just what you need. And you can probably only get that message from somebody who, in the best possible way, has your back and loves you to not in an unhealthy way, but but really cares for bringing out the best in you. Absolutely. So I would say, I think for not just ministers, but for senior leaders, it's actually a really good idea. Just do it well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's getting the right people, right? Yeah. No, and from an IFG point of view, just to say, we think SPADs in general are a good thing. They're very helpful for the civil service because it means the civil service isn't having to do that kind of thing. Right. They don't have to say to the minister, actually, that's not going to play well. It protects the impartiality of the civil service, and it gives that support to ministers that they can't get from anywhere else. Chloe, lots of questions there. Obviously, some specific specifically for you.
Do you really want my
if you
personal
would like to
potted
talk about
biography?
that, but I don't know, maybe you can pick that up separately. But any reflections on that, and particularly, I guess, I'm interested in your point of view of SPADs, but also Lords Ministers.
Yeah. SPADs, actually, I agree with as you just put it. I think that's absolutely correct. They're a good thing. Lords Ministers, I mean, I think actually are an absolutely sort of unsung breed of heroes. You know, the range that they have to cover. You know, these points we're making about how are you maintaining accountability in a very fast-moving environment. You know, Lords Ministers basically have to do that times 5 because they cover everybody else's portfolio at once. You know, in the different chamber. So I have huge admiration for what they do. And in some cases, they can also provide a really nice kind of balancing function, actually, for the Commons ministers. And I mean that in a team dynamics sense. You know, when you have your weekly team meeting as ministers, you know, a good Secretary of State will be using the Lords Minister as a sort of a different speed on the speedometer, and that helps the others to judge what's going on and what are the important things. I'll give a short go at answering Craig's point at the back. And I mean, look, the highly personal version of that is, you know, you tell me anyone else who, you know, looks the same at the age of 27 to the age of 42, and I suspect they won't. And in my particular case also, you know, 2 children and a round of breast cancer gives you plenty of perspective in the same period of time. But actually and I should add, I mean, of course, I've just spent, you know, everyone else has been slaving away on an election campaign, and I've just had brilliant amounts of exercise and more time with my kids. So, you know, yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about that. But in seriousness, you know, what also is there in that same period of time is, you know, 5 election campaigns, the full gamut of backbench opposition through to parliamentary, through to cabinet level experience. I mean, I'm delighted to be on your panel today if that's what I can bring to the conversation. But of course that gives you know, a person a sense of some experience and some development. The trick perhaps for our public realm is how we get the best out of people at all those stages and ages of life, because I mean, I can laugh a little bit now about having come into politics at the age of 27. It was a bit rubbish at the time, but it's really important. It is fundamentally important that we should have young people in our politics as well as older people, because we're a representative democracy, because those bring different perspectives. So how actually do we enable all of that without me having to then sort of sit here and, you know, kind of laugh self-deprecatingly at the frame of the question? We do need a way for people to be able to find comfort and deliver professional and democratic success at different stages of their life and their development.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, very, very IFG. Thank you very much. So I'm going to take some questions from online. So one question from Issa to: how can feedback mechanisms be established to help new ministers assess their performance and make necessary adjustments? I don't know if anyone particular would, I mean, does anyone who's been in government have any experience of particularly structured feedback? Or
No.
No?
Unstructured, yes. Yeah. Unstructured and brutal, yes. Structured, no.
Nothing, yeah. Do people think it would be helpful? I mean, as Chief Whip, Hilary, did you give people that feedback that you were talking about? Yeah, people knew what the assessment was made of them?
One of the reasons I love being Chief Whip was that I was part of a team, and I ran a team, and I ran them as a team. And I would only accept people into the Whip's office who the Prime Minister was prepared to see were starting a journey of progression rather than being dumped, because he needed to give them a job and he could keep them quiet in the Whip's office. I wouldn't have that. They had to be people who would be seen as progressing. And yeah, I mean, it was part of my life. You know, I'd been a social worker, I'd been teaching adults, community and youth work. For me, the whole of this story is about how do you get the best out of people, and how do you enable folk from Sunderland or wherever to make the best of their lives. And that's my sort of base on everything. So of course that's what I would do in government, but everybody didn't do that. And you know, that is a problem.
Yeah,
too many people, and you know, one of my very good friends, when one of the whips came back to me and said, we never have a political team meeting. And I go to the Secretary of State and he says, it's not my responsibility to develop them, I've got enough trouble. And I think that that's a problem.
Yeah,
Just,
Ruth, go on it
just
then.
to expand on that, I mean, I guess, Tim, the reason why you've asked Chloe and Hilary is because they're actually really good ministers and do this kind of thing. But Hilary's absolutely right. It's not universal.
Sure.
And I would sometimes go into a department and go to speak to a junior minister who hadn't had a decent conversation with their Secretary of State for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Yeah.
And of course, what does that do to you as an individual? Firstly, it's really embarrassing if you're a junior minister and you've got no idea what's going on. And so you respond to that in a way which is really problematic. And I just think it ought to be an expectation right across the board, actually, that one of the ways in which we support ministers is not just to succeed individually. And this is an issue with leadership development anyway in general, which it is far too focused on individual progression and success. And actually being in government and being effective in government is being a really, really good part of many overlapping teams. Ministerial teams, teams with political advisors, teams across government, teams with your civil servants. And probably the most underdeveloped skill, but maybe the kind of superpower of effective ministers, is understanding who's in those teams and how can you harness them, because you know the stated ambition for mission government is really big, but it's going to be unbelievably hard, not just because of events, but because change is really, really hard. And it's going to, if your ambition is not just to run a good department but change the country, then you have to start thinking of your teams as being people who are nowhere near Westminster, but actually you need to develop those relationships with them.
Absolutely. Paul, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just a quick, because we're sort of talking about can people develop, and this is one of those areas where people can. So there's a few things that work, and then give them a go, practice them, get experience. So we've touched a little bit about sort of James Timpson, now Lord Timpson. Sir John, his dad, chair of Timpson, sort of handing the baton over, wrote an amazing book. I think they probably sell them in Timpsons, if not they're available online, called Upside Down Management. So I got Sir John to come and talk to the ministers, which is, how do you do upside down management? And so one of the things that you'll notice about the Timpsons, and occasionally on recent interviews with James, but John also, is who's the who's the manager in this Slough branch? And they'll go, oh, hang on, and they'll probably name them right, because they spend most of their time out of the head office at the front line. And what the conversation they have there is, how can I help you? And that's the most simple bit of feedback, but it's your job as senior leader is to help me do my job. Now imagine if that cascaded through the work of government.
Be a very different way of doing things, wouldn't it? Okay, I'm going to run the discussion a little bit over, if that's all right. If you need to head off, please do, but I want to get another round of questions in the room. So there's a man at the back there. Oh my goodness, a lot of questions. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to get to everyone. Please, go for it.
Hi, so my name is Wahid Raja. I'm a paralegal. I'm between jobs at the moment. I worked on... Anyways, so my question is basically, you have departments, and within departments, there's teams, and those people that are already working within those departments, those people, they obviously have like a political agenda themselves because they're individuals as well. So obviously you can have like a new ruling party, but those people want to have a certain way of working or a certain way of doing things. And that actually clashes with what the people actually want, who've elected in a government. Secondly, I just want to add on to that, the people who are running these departments, etc., like the ministers, like within the cabinet office, you can have a minister who's like within the cabinet who's heading transport, and when they have a shuffle, that same person is now doing something like, I don't know, education. So you're spending all this, everything, like all this training, etc., within one sector, and all of a sudden you're keeping that same person who's failed to deliver within that sector into another sector. Personally, I think there should be one person, whoever you choose, and that person from day one should be given that sort of training. This is what the sector is. this is what it needs doing, and you basically choose your team. Not the team is there, and now you have to come in,
Great. I'm going to have to ask you to pass on just because of time. Sorry, but yeah, we'll try and pick up the lady there in the striped top.
Hello, my name's Beth. I'm a public affairs manager for a housing group in the east of England. I live in Norwich, Chloe. As you probably know, there's been a very high turnover of housing ministers in the sector. And my question is kind of twofold. The first is, what can contribute to such a high turnover in that kind of position? And how can a new minister and a new government, how can they bring stability and, more importantly, credibility back to a position like that, which has had such 16 ministers in 14 years?
Great. I'm going to pass it to this gentleman here. Sorry, everyone else. If the panel are kind, they might stay around afterwards. No, don't worry.
Sorry for being the last one. A question, we've sort of heard a little bit about time and time to think.
Your name first,
sorry, Hugh, work at the Ministry of Justice. Time to think, time to go to your constituency, time to be in Parliament. I wonder whether you could reflect a little on the role of your private office in enabling that, when they also have responsibility for managing the conveyor belt of advice and meetings for the department to you.
Great, lots of good questions there. Thank you. So, who would like to, any?
Can I go on private
Chloe,
office
please,
question? I'd love to take that question. Private office is the hero engine of the civil service. I'm a massive fan of private offices. I really am, and that's not only because actually one former member is sitting in the room, but in what they do is, as you described, they are. Given that responsibility, a very profound responsibility of being in charge of all those bits of the sort of conveyor belt. It is a conveyor belt, however much we'd like it not to be. I mean, sometimes it just is some of that. So what you need to do as a minister is form excellent relationships with your private office, which are human relationships, because you are the people who see each other for 14 hours a day. You are the person who has the first cup of coffee in the morning with those people. It's a very, very close human relationship, and only by doing that can you actually then make the kind of machinery and the apparatus work in the ways that you do need to have it work for success. Only if your private office, understands your objectives and understands how you tick, and with some mutuality in that, can you then get the best out of it. But I just want to really say how very fundamental to all of this is the private office. The role of the PPS, the principal private secretary in those offices is. I can't overstate it. They are an absolute cornerstone of the civil service.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And there's plenty more to be read about private office on our website for those who are interested.
I bowl them, you hit them.
Paul, I don't know if we've talked about it a little bit already, but this question about movement between jobs, the importance of stability, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add on that point from,
I just come back to the trust and confidence in that person. If they really don't know anything about the role, if they've not got a great track record, I think there may be a few people coming to a judgment. There's always a bit of a honeymoon period. Maybe there'll be, good, bad or indifferent at this too, but that's quite a short period of time. So more prep. But then I think it's also coming back to what's the role of the minister. Sometimes it is coming back into and working across government. That's their unique skill, because you've got deep subject matter experts in the department. So the talent is leading a team of experts, not necessarily being the expert themselves. I'm not sure in DWP experience how much coding was required by the minister. Probably not, because a lot of that's done by the team, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Hilary, I was wondering about the second question about, or the first question about when there's a change of government, how quickly the civil service adapt to the new politics. What was your experience of that?
I think there are some people in the audience now more than this about this than I do, in that we come in as the minister when it's already happened, and the thing that used to drive me mad, and I still think is a bit of a problem, is that the civil service are not supposed to tell you what happened before and who took what decision before, and which ones worked and which ones didn't. So I was so frustrated during the coalition government, because I'd done, as Moira knows, I'd done the rough sweeping stuff, where we'd reduced the number within 2 years to ones where we could name you every person that was still not inside or off the streets. And nobody, ministers weren't talking to any of us and were not being talked to about what had happened to make sure it did work. And you just think, this is mad, because on an issue like homelessness, it ought to be able to cross different governments in order to make sure you just keep on top of it. So, there are frustrations from our side too, when the changes mean that there is no institutional memory. And I think that is something that we have to take account of. We have more institutional memory than they do in America, which delivers the system that you were talking about, which I don't like. But I actually think the civil service need to be given ways of letting new ministers know something about the institutional memory. I think that is a real problem. But I would go back to what I said earlier. You do not have to be the world's greatest expert in the subject matter. And if you are, you're often a problem. Because then you're not listening to other people. For the sector, they love it when it's somebody they feel likes what they do, whatever the sector is. But if you have somebody who's challenging that, I had real problems with some of the voluntary sector in housing, because they only made money by the sight of people begging on the streets. And when we stopped that and got through that, that was a real problem for them. And I used to have to do dinner after dinner, talking to them and working with them to actually make sure that they understood what we were trying to do, and there were still going to be things they could do. So, it goes both ways.
Absolutely. Ruth, I wonder if you want to pick up on any of those questions or any last words in general.
Sure, just very briefly, and I'm really struck by something that you said, Chloe, about how one of the things that has to stop inevitably is sort of thinking time when you're a minister. And I think we have to be really realistic about this and worried about it. Because I think that, I remember being at Number 10, and somebody I knew who was a brilliant professor of, management stuff came to see me and gave me a 45-minute sort of lecture on stress management and time management and the rest of it. And all it did was make me really angry 45 minutes later for all of the stuff that I had to do. And it was just so divorced from the reality of what it's like when you're at the centre. It was of no use at all. But I caused great offence a couple of years ago by, asking one of the big 4 consultancies, how is it going with their plan to send 2-pint drunk consultants in to tell everyone how to run the country? Because honestly, the emails that you get from so early in the morning to so late at night, their people are having so little sleep, it is genuinely the equivalent of being 2 pints drunk. Now, that is no good. It's no good in the private sector. It's no good in government either. Being realistic about it, though, no time management is going to work because there's too much to be done. The only thing that might work, if we think about supporting ministers, is a focus a little bit on their energy and how, because we can't make more time for them, but how might we be able to support them to put the energy into the things that matter that only they can do, not the things that other people can do. How can we help them really focus? How can we give them the kind of support and building in, not just not long retreats and away days or, long courses, but little pauses in the day to be able to take a breath and get a bit of perspective. So, I guess just the relentlessness and the absolute 360 visibility makes it a really, really difficult position to be in. And so I think if we want good ministers, we've got to think about, might there be ways in which we could attempt to make things a little bit better for them.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think that's a positive note to finish on, so I'm going to close there. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is just the first of many discussions we'll be having at the IFG about the new government, obviously. We are holding events next week about public services and on what the King's speech says about the new government's priorities. So please do join us then. There will be a recording online, video and sound. If you would like more stuff, as I've mentioned, there's lots of stuff on our website, including interviews with both Chloe and Hilary about their times as ministers. And Chloe mentioned earlier on, we are writing something about ministers taking maternity leave, which will be coming out in the autumn. So do keep an eye on that if you're interested in that. I will just end by asking you please to join me in thanking the panel.